This past week, Nintendo released their financial earnings results for Q3 of the fiscal year. That covers October, November, and December. And when compared to the previous holiday season, it wasn't a great report for Nintendo. Their overall revenue was down about 40%. Their hardware sales for consoles was down roughly 30%. But it seems to make sense considering here in a few weeks, the current Switch will be 8 years old. And in about 2 months, we'll have a big presentation around the Switch 2, and then it's onward to next generation. Well, along with this report, Nintendo had like this conference call Q&A with investors, and it seems like many of them are also wondering about the next-gen device. One question in particular, though, was kind of interesting because it did ask Nintendo about their strategy and their thoughts around exclusive games for next generation. Despite the current Switch having ballooned over 150 million, are they still on board with the idea of just creating exclusive games for the new platform? We're going to go over that here today. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're new. Let's take a look at the question right away, because this also then goes into the entire discussion that I see online around exclusive games and if they should even exist in the first place. So we can see this, though. This is machine translated with using Google. We will get an official translation from Nintendo, and they'll iron out any differences and meanings and stuff that can be lost in translation. But I think this kind of gives us a good enough idea as to what Nintendo is getting at here. The question was, many people are currently purchasing the Nintendo Switch. Even though the successor, the Switch 2, has been announced, some people may have purchased it in the hope that new titles for the Nintendo Switch will be released in the future. Will there be a large number of new titles for the Switch after 2025, or will the Nintendo Switch focus on selling classic titles? This is the answer from President of Nintendo, Shintaro Furukawa. Says, we have currently announced Pokemon Legends ZA and Metroid Prime 4 Beyond as titles for the Nintendo Switch scheduled for release in 2025. The Nintendo Switch is a platform that many people can play. We would like to develop and release attractive software if we can. On the other hand, dedicated software is very important when launching new hardware. With that in mind, we would like to consider various ways to enable many consumers to play our games on Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2. So shocking no one, Nintendo, the very traditional game company, does see a significant importance around having exclusive games for a platform launch, and then I assume just the platform going forward in general, because Nintendo, while they do have many people right now on the Switch, they do want to kind of get people over to the Switch 2, I'd say as fast as possible. Although I do feel like they're going to sell the current Switch probably for a few more years, even after the Switch 2 comes out. And I also wouldn't be shocked if they introduce like a revised Switch just to continue lowering the price point and the cost. Think of how we were all talking about the Switch when it had come out and everyone was excited about it, and then randomly Nintendo shows up at night and is like, hey, here's the 2DS XL. It's like, oh, all right, well, okay, that makes sense. They pulled back on some of the hardware costs and they released it, I thought, at a pretty good price point. I think it was like, what, $150 or something? So I'm kind of envisioning something similar to happen with the current Switch. I don't think the lineup is going to exist the way it does now. Switch Lite, Redbox Switch, Switch OLED. I think they're going to refine that down, maybe even to one SKU. So I'm curious how they're going to work that part out. But software clearly is of interest to the investors because that's where Nintendo makes their money. Now, the current Switch has done quite well for them. Over 1.3 billion pieces of software. Very good chance, depending on how things continue to go over the next couple of years, they could reach 1.5 billion pieces of software, which you don't really see that often. The PS2 did it. It took the PS2 a long time to get there, though. So the Switch doing that even in the next 2 years would be well out in front of that in terms of like the amount of time it took. So I think they mentioned Pokemon Legends ZA, and it's kind of funny in that regard because I do think the company that will kind of stick around with the current Switch longer than probably anything with Nintendo publishing on it is going to be Game Freak. They did it with the DS, and I was trying to think of a comparable here, and you'd have to go to the DS. I mean, that's 154 or so million units sold. The Switch is going to be passing that soonish, but you have to look at that and go, okay, that's probably the one where it would kind of put Nintendo in a bind to move on from that to the 3DS immediately. I think they had a Kirby game that came out on the DS after the 3DS had come out. But, I mean, we had Pokemon Conquest came out. Pokemon Black and White 2, that came out on the DS. So Game Freak, they'll hang back a bit, I think. Pokemon Legends ZA being an obvious one. But I kind of hope that they have plans to do something cross-gen related with their next Pokemon game, because I feel like they are going to look at the current Switch and be like, we can make it work there. It might not be great because we saw it happen with Scarlet and Violet, but it would at least run. I hope in their mind they're like, but we can also have a version for the Switch 2. And even if that's patched in, so you download a patch after you buy the Switch version, especially if we have a shared eShop there, I guess. But if that is the case, then at least we can still get a good version, a decent running version of their next big Pokemon game, because that Switch trying to run it's going to be something else. And I guess it would be kind of interesting to see the Game Freak maybe have a Let's Go remake that is on the current Switch, runs backwards compatible with the next system, the Switch 2, and then they go all out on a dedicated next generation Pokemon game just for the Switch 2. I feel like that is the best path for them, because clearly they're going to be dabbling in cross-gen one way or the other. The question really comes down to, how much will Nintendo get involved with that? I brought up the idea of what if Mario Kart was cross-gen, but after then we see that how many racers would be maybe on one track. Doesn't necessarily feel like something that the current Switch would be able to handle well, especially at the higher frame rate that I assume they'd be shooting for at 60. So maybe that one is kind of out the window, but who knows, maybe a new Kirby game? That wouldn't shock me if that was a cross-gen title. However, Nintendo is definitely focused in on the idea of exclusive software for their hardware, which the idea of exclusives has come up as a very contentious topic online. It wasn't long ago that you would just see exclusives as kind of forming the identity for that hardware. And I feel like this was something that made more sense probably a couple generations ago. I could even say maybe the PS3 and the 360, because we had hardware that was very different from one another, for better or worse. The PS3 cell processor, when utilized well, could do some very impressive things, but third parties weren't really interested in investing that kind of time and money into it. Now, first party with Sony did, and they made some pretty impressive stuff there, but that's the last time I can really think of hardware being extremely unique from one another, because after that, it became obvious from Microsoft standpoint and Sony standpoint, x86, AMD, and make it very easy on developers to move their games back and forth. And once that happens, you look at the first party games and be like, well, those could also be on all these different devices pretty easily, right? Well, within reason, of course, for developers and porting. And that's where I think the luster around exclusive titles starts to kind of be lost. So back in the day with like the Super Nintendo and the Genesis and then the PS1 and Saturn and stuff, there was kind of that discussion of, can this system even run this game? Because this hardware is really good at 2D versus 3D, and we don't really have that anymore. So I do kind of understand why it's not exclusives don't feel as, I guess special would be the right word, for that hardware. To really give it its identity. Even characters now, as we're seeing Microsoft move their games across the board just about, and Master Chief is seemingly closing in on maybe jumping to PlayStation or Nintendo, even that's not really backing up some of these pieces of hardware anymore. So Nintendo, being as traditional as they are, it really does come down to them being, I guess, just hard-headed, but also just their business strategy and something that's worked most times for them in the past. So yes, they are going to be sticking it out here when it comes to exclusives. Is that good or bad? Well, it seems to depend on people's viewpoints online. I will admit there are times where you play a Switch game. I play one and I'd be like, man, this would probably be a much better experience on more capable hardware, which, hey, there you go. It's coming up on the Switch too. But like at that time, man, it'd been interesting if Nintendo had put this on the PC and let people go crazy with their builds and stuff. But Nintendo is pretty stubborn when it comes to this kind of thing, and while I believe they'll be utilizing cell phones more than any, it's going to be interesting to see what their strategy is when it comes to exclusive titles for the Switch 2, because maybe that comes in the way of games that are developed for the Switch but then get patches that then move it up to a Switch 2 version, and that could even be paid for or free patches. There are a lot of question marks still around this system. Take Metroid Prime 4 Beyond as what I think would be a great example in this case, since it's coming from Nintendo first party completely with Retro Studios, who typically leans into the technology side of things and puts out games that punch well above the weight class of the device that it's developed for. Many people look at Metroid Prime Remastered on the Switch as one of, if not the best looking and running Switch games. So what could they do with the Switch 2? And will Metroid Prime 4 be that situation like Breath of the Wild, where it's on the Switch, but then also on the Switch 2? And could that be way of a patch or just a dedicated Switch 2 version at retail? But they were pretty quick to answer that they do believe exclusive titles are what are going to move the needle for them in the next generation launch. And if they got a big 3D Mario game there or a Mario Kart with 24 people racing around, it's hard to argue with them, because that does sound like a very compelling title to pick up alongside of the new shiny Switch system. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below, whether it's exclusives being good or bad in general for gaming and the consumer, and how you think Nintendo's going to navigate coming off of an incredible success with the current Switch into what is right now known as a bit of an unknown, we'll say, with the Switch 2. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.